All right, we are in our last segment with Andy Fang. Andy, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey everyone,
All right,
Hugo, good to
so
see
a
you again.
quick, thanks. Andy's been with us before in his own dedicated webinar with us, but I'm going to give you a quick background on Andy. So Andy's the founder of Veta Virtual, a leading boutique legal virtual receptionist company that services over 150 firms across North America. And Andy, you're in Canada right now, but you'll be moving to LA soon, right?
Yes, in March.
Awesome. And
Escaping the
so,
cold.
yeah, and Veta Virtual provides white glove services with dedicated teams of 5 to 8 specialists at a time, handling everything from calls to appointment scheduling and custom intake forms. Andy's commitment to client service and innovation sets Veta Virtual apart in the legal industry. And I just learned this morning that he's a former Deloitte consultant. So I think that speaks a lot to how process oriented he is, how scalable his company is, and how much skill his service is scalable for law firms that are generating a couple calls a day, who are aiming to answer several hundred calls a day. So today we're going to be talking namely about aspects of something that he and his team produced called the Ultimate Law Firm Intake Guide of 2025. I'm actually going to pull up my screen for a moment so that you guys can see a landing page for which we're going to share a link for. So you should be able to see my screen where it says the Ultimate Law Firm Intake Guide. It's how many pages, Andy?
I think it's over 50.
Over 50 pages.
A
All
lot.
right, so you're going to identify common intake mistakes, how to fix them, implement a proven intake framework, automate and optimize your lead gen process, reduce no-shows. We'll put the link on our on the chat, rather the Q&A on the chat and on email correspondence. And we're going to be talking about some aspects of this massive document today. So first, thanks again, Andy. I'm just curious, like, what have you seen as like the main reason that attorneys call a company like yours to start with scalable intake?
Yeah, that's a great question, Hugo. There are typically several reasons. I would say the biggest one that we've seen is attorneys and offices realize they just don't have the technology, the process, and the people to have a very optimized intake process. And with these processes, it's becoming a lot more advanced with different tools that you have to use, and the callers and clients are becoming a lot more demanding over the years.
Yeah.
So that's why most people decide to outsource versus doing it in-house.
Yeah, it's deceiving in that it just feels like, oh, we just need to answer calls, but no, there's answering calls, there's documenting calls, there's doing follow-up, then there's connecting that to back-end operations and your CRM. So, but one thing that I think is really interesting about your doc is I just always like to look at the macro first, like what makes intake great, and whether or not it's in-house or a third party, it's people, it's the staff. So I wanted to start off with these 8 points here about what makes great intake staff. And this is either going to be a reminder for many attorneys who already have some kind of intake staff or some kind of intake process, or it might be completely brand new information. For those in the latter category, this is super important because emotional intelligence is oftentimes a huge component of great intake. So, Andy, why don't we start off with this first aspect of great intake staff, someone that's friendly.
Yeah, I think this is the bare basic that when we look for team members for a company or when we advise clients, right? You want to have someone on the phone that just have energy and they're just nice people, right? Versus talking to someone who is very low energy and just makes your caller feel like they're not welcome. So being friendly is the most important part of a great intake staff.
Yeah, and the context is most people don't want to talk to attorneys, right? There's some great exceptions to that, like great moments in your life where you're getting an awesome immigration situation or maybe adoption. These are great, but more often than not, DUI, family law, divorce, car accidents, really delicate situations. People in really difficult situations don't want to speak to someone who's just kind of phoning it in, for lack of a better way to say it. Let's talk about professional. How do you screen for professionalism from your intake staff?
Yeah, I think it all start with resume interview, right? I truly believe how you do one thing is how you do everything in life. So from those, we start looking at, okay, if you're applying for a role of a receptionist or intake staff, how do you present yourself in an interview? How do you present yourself on a day-to-day conversation with your team members, with other clients, right? Because how you do that is a reflection of yourself and a reflection of your professional demeanor. And that's how we screen them.
Is there like a role that you found that surprised you in someone's CV that kind of forays well into intake staff?
Yeah, that's a great question. What we find is any sort of hospitality role typically transitions pretty well into the intake staff, just because in a hospitality type of role, sometimes you're dealing with unpleasant people, right? How do you stay calm? How do you stay composed under pressure, right? I think on a phone call when things are very critical, those soft skills really translates very well.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I spoke to an attorney about a month ago who likes to hire former bartenders for
Yes.
their intake staff, and it's because they know how to talk to people. I thought that was like so dialed in, and it works for them. That's why I asked you that question. Now, empathy. How do you gauge empathy? Someone's like EQ or ability to be empathetic on a job interview to get that staff.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think empathy is more than just, oh, hey, I've heard your issue, right? But I think how we really look at empathy is if a client's saying, hey, I have these issues, did you actually respond to the issues individually, right? Because I think just the saying some words saying, yeah, I'm sorry you're having this problem, but the client is looking for a result, right? What are you going to do for me next? So be able to pinpoint and actually deliver information that targets these individual pain points. That's what true empathy is.
Yeah, and so I'm curious, like, how do you keep that up? Because like one of the things we hear from intake staff, whether it's in-house or third party, is that they can burn out a lot on either call volume or the nature of the calls or both. And so how do you get your team to kind of weather kind of the peaks and valleys, namely the valleys, and dealing with hearing all these traumatic calls fairly
Yeah.
regularly?
Yeah, good
Because
question.
keeping that empathy up is just like, it's part of your job, and it can be
It's
pretty
tiring.
emotionally exhausting.
Yeah, it can be tiring. I think a lot of it is just training, right? Before we have staff on the phone, really just drill into their head that whatever happens on the call happens on the call, right? It's not a reflection of you. It's not a reflection of your role. It's not a reflection of what happens in your life. And be able to separate that is really, really important. And it's continuous training based on that point as well, because we have had people that says, hey, these calls are just so hard on me mentally, right? I don't know if I can do this anymore. I think it's a continuous uphill battle. There's no one easy solution that solves the issue. It is definitely a continuous process that we're always working on.
When you rolled this out, I shared this a few months ago. I actually shared this with several attorneys that were looking for like a rubric of what to look for in intake. They found it really helpful when they were trying to hire for management of intake, which I thought was pretty fascinating, that they were looking for a leader who understood these qualities for their own hiring efforts. I mean, aside from hiring, like, do you think that this is appropriate to vet out other third-party intake centers as well? Let's say you're not bringing it in-house, you want to take a third party. Do you think this is also appropriate in that regard?
Yes, of course, because I truly believe the intake process is one of the most crucial part of attorney office operation, right? I tell all my clients, anyone can answer the phone for you, but that's not a lot of value add. But how do you make sure that your callers feel we're listening to issue empathetically and really calming them and making sure that, hey, even though we're not the people that's going to solve your problem, but I'm going to make you feel comfortable enough to think that we're the people that are going to solve your problem. I think that's the most important part, right? I think too many clients, they've used other services before where they just sound robotic, right?
Yeah.
People calling in, they don't actually care about who they are, what their issues are. They're just trying to get a name and a number and pass them on. I think that is not in this day and age, it's just not going to work.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Because also there's the tech implications in the training, which is that's one thing I wanted to get through. And number four about experience, that naturally anyone wants someone with experience, but how long do you think is a fair amount of runway for someone to be trained on the specifics of intake, on the EQ, on different case types, on like that shorthand of understanding what the consumer is going through? Like, to gain that experience, what's a fair amount of time that you need to give to third party intake, or rather in training someone to fit into your intake process?
Typically, I would say 3 to 6 months. For example, internally, all of our intake staff are going through a very rigorous training process that's about 4 months long
Yeah.
before they're fully trained. Just because with legal, there's so many different intricacies, small details, and every firm operates differently, right? Two personal injury firms in New York going to be different. How do you learn those details and be able to action on those details and understand what the clients need and what they want? And that will take some time.
Yeah, I mean that's a significant amount of time. That's long, much longer than I was expecting to hear, to be honest. So 4 months, you find that that's kind of like the bare minimum to
Yeah.
see if they're a fit. That's fascinating. And when it comes to when you hire for hospitality or folks with hospitality backgrounds, do you also look for people that work in customer support, because you do prioritize customer care, customer service? Does that fit into the mold too of the person that you're hiring? Someone that's worked at like a Zendesk kind of situation?
Yeah, exactly. It's the ability for them to multitask, deal with the volume of calls that are coming in. I really just work in an environment where it is pretty fast paced, right? Every ticket, every call is going to be different. And without that previous experience, some people just don't really understand what the role requires, and
Yeah.
they just filter themselves out very, very quickly.
When you're working with volumes, like let's say you're generating 50 to 250 calls a month. Um, what's a way to measure? Do you have a metric or a KPI or an indicator that says these calls were handled with exceptional customer care, poor customer care, and everything in between? How do you measure that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So internally, we actually run every call through auto QA system that we built in house. So we'll track, how the sentiment of the calls. Did the agent follow the standard operating procedure that we put in? Were there
Wow.
any, bad words that were used? Right, we use those to measure the sentiment as well. First call resolution. Those are some very, very important metrics, because what we want to do is make sure that people don't call back as much as previously. Right, we've had clients or callers that they keep calling 5 times and say, hey, I'm not getting an answer. Right, those calls gets flagged as well. So I would say, first call resolution is probably the most important metric that we look for.
Is that a service that you're using, this automatic queue quality assurance tool?
Yes, it's we built it in-house.
Oh, you built it.
We built it
Can you
in-house.
speak a little bit about that? Like, what prompted you to build your own automatic QA service or tool,
Yeah,
rather?
so it's a great question. So previously we had a full QA team that were auditing calls, but throwing labor at an issue is typically not the best solution, and one person can only listen to so many, and they will miss things. So when the new ChatGPT and OpenAI resources came out, we took a look at that and realized a lot of the call screening or QA can be done using AI. So we run the calls through that and then have a human that layers on top to check the ones that the AI cannot resolve, right? So we still go back and listen to the calls, but now we're just doing a much bigger scale.
Andy, I think you built another business. Like that's like tool I think a lot of us want to use. I'm actually going to ping you on that because
Watch out,
uh,
flying.
yeah, that is a huge pain point for some of our attorney members who are generating literally thousands of calls a month, and they can only spot check on quality assurance. One thing that we've experimented with is like taking audio from the audio files of phone calls where we have consent to record, and we put them in Gemini, and then we tell Gemini or the Google AI platform, report back to us where the strengths were, like a SWOT analysis, like what
Right.
was good, what was bad, what do we need to work on. And we've always thought that this tool is absolutely necessary. Automated QA. Is it powered at all by any like AI model?
Yeah, we're using OpenAI right now.
OpenAI. Okay,
Yeah,
so
but we're also
that's
testing Anthropic Claude, as well as Gemini, just because I think, going forward, how AI system going to be built is going to be multimodal, right? It's not going to be one type of LLM that you're calling. Different providers are good at different things, and we're trying to figure out, okay, what are they actually good at?
Yeah,
We're trying to
that's
benchmark the
fascinating.
results.
I mean, Andy, we'd love to demo that in front of all of these attendees at some point. So we'll definitely be
Sounds
talking.
good. No pressure there, right?
So these last points, active listening, conflict resolution, and knowledge legal term, I kind of bucket those under training. And can you speak to anyone that you find like most critical to the handling of a successful intake call?
Yeah, I would say, active listening and conflict resolution. I think legal terms you can teach fairly easily compared to the rest because it's a hard skill versus soft skill. And when we do look at intake staff, it's about, are they actually listening to the client's issue, right?
Right.
As well as when the client is pissed or mad, how do you calm them down, right? How do you make sure that when they leave the call, they're happy or at least a lot more calm than before? I think those skills are harder to train, I would say. So we try to screen them out during interview process. We do a mock call with the angry customer and how they resolve that, right? Those are the things we look for.
Excellent. Yeah. So again, this is on the ultimate guide. I'm actually going to go backwards in this guide for our next line of questioning. It's going to be, I mean, you can see this is a pretty meaty document. It's pretty awesome. And again, you can get your own copy here. We'll share the link on our post-show emails. So one of the things that we've previously discussed, I would love to hear more of a high level of the critical stages of intake process. There's a breakdown of each one of these segments in this document, but today I'd love you to speak towards initial contact, data gathering, follow-up processes, what are the tools that you're using more often than not, and then conversion. So, and then lastly, just going to end with some line of questioning on AI, because It's just top of mind with everyone. So talk us through how you define these critical stages of intake, and then just a breakdown briefly on each of these sections.
Yeah, for sure. So initial contact is when a client first contacts you, right? Fairly simple. First phone call, first contact us form. And then information gathering is when you get into contact with the client on the live call or you send them intake, right? So when that is done, typically they fall into the follow-up bucket. They fill the intake form. Did they book a consultation? If they did a consultation, what's next, right? Did they decide to move forward? And then lastly is a conversion. That's when you send a retainer agreement or have the initial deposit paid. I think the first critical stage of initial contact is because the first impression matters, right? When a potential client reaches out, timing is literally everything. Nowadays, it's so competitive. If you don't respond within seconds, they will call somebody else, right? We've had so many cases where callers will call in and we pick up the phone. They're like, wow, you're the first firm that picked up that's on the list of Google, right? And,
wow.
And we got the business because of that.
Do you think that's like the biggest, because when I talk to you about your current clients rather, it seems like when you onboard them, like their performance metrics significantly change from when they do it in-house. What is the biggest difference that you notice in that first month of how you guys do it versus the way the law firms initially did it before signing with you guys? Like what's the biggest like difference that you see in how they handle calls and how much more successful you guys are at in managing that intake?
I would say the biggest difference is the response time. So I would use example as most firms have a contact us form on their website.
Yeah.
I think on average, the response time for those forms is probably over 24 hours for most.
Oh my gosh. That's wild.
Right.
That offends me as a marketer.
Right. And in 10 minutes, someone can go on Google and probably fill out 50 of these if they really wanted to.
Yeah.
Right. And typically what clients do is they send those forms to us. Instead of 24 hours, we typically call them within the first 5 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Even 5 minutes feels too long. Like we preach like ASAP. Like,
Exactly.
especially if there's a call queue, if you have a telephony system where you can prioritize phone numbers that come in, we tell the attorneys all the time, prioritize our calls ahead of everything else, especially if it's an outbound, because that's a competitive lead. They're going to go to your competitor immediately if you don't call ASAP. So I think there's actually a Harvard Business Review study on response rates that the optimal response time is, I think, 2.5 minutes maximum. And then anything after that, it drops, like 80% of the likelihood of them answering drops like significantly. So yeah, it's so, I think you're 100% right. We hear this too. It's like, if you're slow to call your leads, you're toast. And it's like the most basic thing. Like,
Right.
people just want to be heard, right? I'm curious if there's another thing that you found as a big differential between the way you guys manage intake versus when that law firm, prior to the law firm working with you guys.
Yeah, for sure. And another thing that we try to do is do as much as we can on the first call, right? When a caller calls in, we pick up the call, we do the intake, and we also book them in for consultations. If you offer consultations for some clients, they don't offer consultations, then we don't do that. Because another thing that we realize is a lot of our clients, before they come in, there's typically drop-offs between each of these stages where they hang up the phone, they have to wait for someone in the office to get back to them. But every single time there's a drop-off in communication, there's a decrease in conversion rate, right? Because some people just forget. So our goal is, how do I do the intake, book the appointments all on the first call while the lead is hot, while we have them on the phone? If
Right.
they're not qualified, at least we can cancel the appointment after, right? Versus trying to play phone tag and calling them back, try to book someone in. Your conversion is going to be much, much lower if you do that.
Yeah, we have a question here, and it's related to everything you just discussed. Someone said, if I'm seeing increased call volume or increased lead volume, how can I handle that without overwhelming my intake team?
That's you should come to me. I'm just kidding. There are services like what we offer, right? Dedicated legal answering service and virtual receptions front desk services that helps with exactly doing that, right? For some of our clients, we become the first line of defense. We'll take all the intake calls. But for some of our clients where they already have an intake team, we can be the backup. So anything that's overflow that your team don't answer when they're on vacation, we can do that as well. So this way you're spending the most cost-effective amount while getting the full support.
Yeah, that's great. And this is especially true if you're making a bigger investment in marketing, if you're buying billboards, if you've got some kind of print campaign for the next 6 weeks, 6 months, you want that overflow to ensure that someone's answering those calls. That's a great question. So yeah, just have more than what you need is kind of the short answer, right?
Exactly. Especially if you're running marketing campaign, right? Those are 5-figure, 6-figure marketing dollars that if you don't answer, they're just going down the drain.
That's fast. So let's talk about information gathering briefly. Like one of the things that I was so impressed by when I initially spoke to you was that you guys do custom intake for everyone. And so what does information gathering mean to you guys and custom intake design?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of it is qualifying the lead and gathering information in a very effective manner, right? Most of our clients, before they come to us, they're still using PDFs or Word documents for their intake. But what we do is we help them digitize them and create a custom form that has questions that are only related to their firm, right? 2 different firms going to want to ask 2 different types of intake questions, or for different type of cases, they have different follow-up questions. So we can even set up conditional formatting on some of these. So based on the type of cases they're looking for, ask additional questions on top. And then once the form is done, we submit them. Those typically get sent to client and get stored in their database with integrations with other legal practice management software as well. So those information gets injected and then they go out in real time.
That's great. So what do you believe most people are like when you survey a law firm's current intake, what do you think that they are often asking that they shouldn't be asking, and what do you see that they're often missing in their first call intake?
That's a great question.
I stumped you finally.
Hugo, you always ask the good questions. I think the one thing that people don't ask enough is people don't typically care about what tools we use. I think that's actually a very important question, right? The reason why I ask is, what is the scalability of these tools? Because our goal is to grow with every client that we have. But how a firm operates as a solo is going to be very different how a firm operates when they have 10 attorneys, right?
Yeah.
So we want to pick the right set of tools that is going to fit for both scenarios, because retooling a firm is very, very costly and it's a very lengthy process. Especially you have to train everybody on those set of tools.
Yeah, that's great. And that actually is a good segue to follow-up, because so much of the follow-up section in your ultimate intake guide has to do with what tactics, what tools, what are the SaaS, the services that you're using to get in front of people on that initial intake, after that initial intake, etc. Please talk about how critical follow-up is and how critical the tools are that you mentioned here are.
Yeah, I think follow-up is where the money is at, right? Because there's no way we can convert 100% of the leads that you get. That's just impossible. No matter, I can't even personally do it, right? So for the portion of leads that we don't actually convert, how do we put them in a campaign that keep them top of mind for you and for themselves, right? For example, one of the workflow that we set up for family law attorney here in Toronto, Canada, is we set up a cadence where after with the initial consultation, did they make the payment? If they did, send another notification to the internal team to check that. If they didn't, send a notification to the internal team to cancel the appointment, right? And then send in ID verification to links, intake forms to the actual caller before the session's over, or before the session starts, and then 24-hour do another check to see if they actually filled out those information, right? Having these automations in place can save your team a lot of time, and as well as disqualify the people that's going to waste your time, right?
And you mentioned you do this via email, you do this via text, you have your own internal systems that do this kind of outreach. Like, what else are you using? What are the other like scheduling tools? Can you speak more to, especially what you speak to on the intake guide? Like, what are the tools that are really cost effective that everyone should be using for their own intake?
Yeah. So for most clients, they'll have a Clio, MyCase, Lawmatics, practice management software. They have some sort of booking system internally, but what I find is a tool called Calendly that works the best. I will say 80% of our clients are on that tool. It's the one with the most amount of integrations and customizations. And in terms of the actual form itself, we use Jotform. That's the one that I recommend.
Can you say that one again?
Jotform.
Jotform, yeah,
Jotform. I think Clio has a pretty extensive one, and most practice management software will have their own. But for us, for the sake of integrations and usability for most clients, that's what we use internally.
And Jotform lets you kind of create those logic trees. Like, if yes, then these
exactly.
Come up. If no, these are that is great intake when it feels natural on the phone as a result of the intake guiding that person on the phone through the conversation. It just kind of makes it like dummy proof, error proof.
Exactly.
And
so the people don't have to think
what
type of questions they need to ask.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So tech, would you argue that tech is the most important aspect of follow, aside from just wanting to do follow-up, but just like, absolutely, you said it's where the money is, follow-up. Do you think it's really based on the tech?
I think so. I think most follow-ups are automated nowadays. I think everyone wants to do follow-ups, but the problem is not everyone has time for follow-ups, right? That's where when the tools come in to help you resolve that.
Naturally they could hire you, right? For sure. But let's say someone wanted to do this on their own, to build out their own follow-up funnels. What do you think is the best way for a small business to go about that? Who should they call?
That's a great question. So you can definitely go on Google and search for these materials. We have done a lot of system implementation for firms as well. We don't have to use this as a service. There's definitely consultants out there. I would say most of the tools are fairly self-explanatory. If you want to set up a pretty simple flow, you can figure it out in less than 2 hours. It's when you get into the complexity of integrations, having different tools work together, that's when what I would recommend having an expert come in to do that.
Yeah, I think we're at this point where if you don't have automated follow-up in some aspect of your business, you're behind. There's got to be some efficiency made on everyone that's in your database that needs to be spoken to on some kind of cadence, whether it's every day, every other day, every week, every month, every quarter. That's got to happen at scale because competition is just getting more fierce. Whoever's in front, to Andy, your point is whoever's in front, whoever's first, they get the business. You could be not the best attorney in the world and still earn the business just as a function of you being first and you having great follow-up. Naturally, we don't want that for the consumer. We want the best, practitioners for the consumer. But the reality is, whoever has these systems built out will end up winning that business. So lastly, on conversion, and then we'll get momentarily into AI because we're just at about time, and we have some questions for you in the Q&A.
Sure.
So can you speak briefly on conversion, on how this fits into your model?
Yeah, so for most of our conversions, when we track internally, is either free consultation or paid consultation booked. We just had a criminal defense attorney talk to us and say, hey, I don't know what your team is doing, but your conversion is better than the last provider that we used. I think at the end of the day, we're not going to be the one doing the consultation for most clients, but getting them booked is the most important part, right? Because if you don't get them booked, they're never going to show up and you're never going to have even the chance to convert these clients. So that's where our ultimate goal is.
A lot of attorneys ask, who are the intake companies that can also get signatures for, retainers? At some point, do you anticipate that being part of your service?
Yes, that is something we're looking at. I think there are a lot of things we can do in life, and a lot of things I can do in business, but our goal is to focus on the things that we do really, really well in and expand on the things later.
Yeah, that's great. So there's some questions here. I'm actually just going to focus on this one from Scotty Malajandra. He says, what is the cost for Veta Virtual Services? Not sure if you want to have that discussion here, or at least give us a range or starting point.
Yeah, for sure. For most of our attorney clients, it's all on a minutes package, right? For a starter plan, it starts at $265 per month and it goes up from there. It ranges. We have clients go from $265, and then if you're using a couple hundred calls a month, it can go upwards a couple $1,000. And every time you move up a tier, your permanent price comes down. So it's become more cost effective over time.
Excellent. So, and what's your email, just in case someone wants to reach out to you for?
Yeah, for sure. It's andy@vetavirtual.com.
Excellent. So, I just want to wrap here with AI. So I've been talking, I talk regularly to owners of virtual assistant, virtual professional organizations. They feel, and they, when they're in the capital markets, private or not, it's like they always get the sense that their companies are not as valuable as they used to be as a result of them believing, AI agents are going to take over a lot of accounting jobs and bookkeeping jobs and copywriting jobs and graphic. I mean, we sort of see it. And I'm just curious what your position is, calling along on intake with AI. Like, do you believe that your company will inevitably be made of AI agents, or do you think that humans will always be a part of the supply chain?
I might be biased based on the business I'm in, but
Sure.
I do think human will always be part of some sort of conversation, right? Hey, maybe the AI can do the very initial screening and then a human agent comes in to do the rest. Because I truly believe as we move more digital, as we move towards the AI age, people actually want that human connection. They want to know they're speaking to a real person. They want to know that, hey, there's someone on the other line that understands my issue and understands my problem and they can help me, right? Versus just talking to a robot. Of course, I'm not naive. I think AI is coming for all of us, but it's how do we leverage AI to provide a better experience for our callers, right? One of the tools that we're developing is how do we use AI to provide agent assist for our team members. So when a caller says certain things, how do we prompt the next step on the screen so the team members don't have to think, they just know what to do. right? And we can customize it based on each client as well, because different clients want different things done at different times.
I think you speak to our position too. It's not that AI is going to replace the intake team or the agency. The AI is going to be a huge supplement so that every individual person is like 10x more efficient.
Correct.
They can do a lot more work, a lot higher quality work in a fraction of the time. And that seems to be the use case everywhere. I think the concerns that valuations are tanking in the virtual assistant space are kind of overhyped. So it's interesting to hear your take too. So Andy, thank you so much. Any final words before we wrap up here and we get into our bonus Q&A?
Yeah, any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to provide value and answer any concerns and issues. I think at the end of the day, I just love seeing people make it and they be successful. I mean, I think everyone here loves doing law because they want to help people, right? At the end of the day, I think providing value is the most important thing I'm looking for in life. So any question, feel free to let me know. And Hugo, always great to speak to you, and I will see you in LA when I move.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy. Thank you so much, man.